Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Molineux, and my co-presenter is Matt Finch, and we're talking to you today about scenario planning as a tool for occupational therapy students, but also for occupational therapists to think about and plan for the future, particularly futures that we don't even know about yet. Before we go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are meeting. And for me at the moment, that are the Yuggera, Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be with us today. So thank you and welcome.
I just wanted to add actually already, Matthew, I was thinking how important it is for us to do this when we're in these virtual spaces. Like, this comes off a presentation for the Royal College of Occupational Therapists in the UK. You know, it's not being hosted in Australia, and yet when we live in these Zoom boxes, it's easy to forget that like each one of us is on a particular territory with a particular history, a sense of who's been allowed to say they belong to a land or that the land belongs to them, who's had power and privilege. And so also as an Anglo-German speaking from London, I just wanted to reiterate that. But it's so easy for us when we're in these boxes, when the phone or the doorbell is ringing in the background, to sort of enter this virtualized space where we forget about history, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very important. So what Matt and we've given a presentation, which was a 3-minute version, but we thought we would give another version in case people want to hear a bit more, and in a format where we're not restricted by time, essentially. So we're going to try something a bit different, which is really the nature of the work that Matt and I have done together over the years. Has always been trying things a bit differently, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're here, like I've got a cup of coffee because it's the morning in the UK. Matthew's got an appropriately cool drink for a Brisbane evening. And it just gives a bit of a chance to chat more informally and more extensively about some of the work we've been doing, thinking about the future of occupational therapy. And I wondered if I could ask you, first of all, actually, Matthew, about this first slide, because you know, we just talked about acknowledging history and the past. And one of the reasons I think we started working together is because of your interest in how the role and identity of occupational therapy has changed over the years. So we kind of met over a dirty bucket, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that dirty bucket.
So the dirty bucket that Matt is referring to is from a chapter I wrote back in 2004. The book was published. And it was called Occupation. The chapter was called Occupation in Occupational Therapy, a Labour in Vain ? And the labour in vain bit comes from a bit of penal history in Australia. So because one of the punishments that was given to the convicts when they were in Australia was a labour in vain. That was the name of the punishment. And one of those it was essentially to get them to do something completely futile and purposeless. And so one of the versions of that was they would get a bucket, which was usually the bucket that had been used as a toilet. So it was filthy with all sorts of human excrement. And the task, the labour in vain was to clean, but not only clean, but to polish the bucket so that it was absolutely sparkling clean and shiny. Clearly, that wasn't necessary for the job the bucket was fulfilling because it was a toilet. And so it was meant to be that task that just kept people busy and occupied, but didn't have any meaning or purpose, or any deep meaning and purpose. But we could talk about meaning and purpose for a long time, but that's the labour in vain. And so, yeah, Matt and I have, we spoke about that, but then we started talking about all sorts of things. And actually, Matt came to understand occupational therapy quite deeply through his contact with us and his interest, but also some of your skills and experiences actually were incredibly relevant, I think, anyway, to occupational therapy. And I think the scenario planning is just one example of that.
That's very kind of you to say. I work a lot with information institutions and libraries and archives, but also as a strategist with all kinds of organizations. And this notion of occupation being the things that you want, need, and have to do, and the idea of occupational therapy being about addressing dysfunction in those occupations through the medium of the occupation itself, that was the initial understanding that drew me in. because it had such a wide range of applications, and that lens was a healthcare lens in some ways, but it wasn't just like the medical paradigm. So I thought it was a way of looking at the world that was incredibly useful. And as you say, Matthew, you know, I came across your written academic work, and it was very much about how occupational therapy configures itself differently in different eras, because of institutional and social and ideological and intellectual pressures. And so we sort of hit on this idea, didn't we, of kind of using the future to explore what OT could be, and particularly in the context of the course that you run at Griffith. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the OT undergraduate course at Griffith, about the role emerging placements, and your notion of what it means to train OTs for the future.
So I guess in a nutshell, we do take a very strong occupational focus in the 4-year program at Griffith. And by that, we mean occupation is front and center. It is absolutely explicit. It is prioritized over all sorts of other things. But that's not to mean students don't learn all those other knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are important. But we just put those in place and help students see them in relation to occupation. And so one of the things that we are very explicit about as well is we want students to use that occupational perspective that is unique to occupational therapy to think about what are some of the different ways that the profession could contribute to society beyond traditional health and social care. And so we have built in a number of courses and experiences and approaches to push students and support students to develop knowledge and skills in thinking differently. And one of those is a role emerging placement. And I know they are used in lots of universities, including some in the UK. And I think one of the distinctions for us, and I know it is the case for at least one other university and probably others, is role emerging placements first started as a way to deal with the placement shortage. So it was, well, let's send them somewhere and give them an experience that they can use to think about in relation to occupational therapy. From my experience of using role emerging placements at Leeds Beckett University, we just saw the power of role emerging placements to really challenge, but also provide students with a completely unique experience to relate to understand occupational therapy, occupation, and the role that could play in a whole range of different settings outside of traditional health and social care. So we have one of those built into Griffith as one of the strategies to get students thinking very broadly, because I think it's quite hard for students who come in with a very narrow view of occupational therapy for them to think about what are the possibilities when all we know is what's currently done. And so I think that's where some of this work with Matt, and particularly around scenario planning, was a fantastic technique to really help students jump out of where we currently are into something weird and fantastical, and you'll hear a bit about that in a minute, to really think about what is possible.
Yeah, and I think there's really a connection between that work and the futures work we did together. That notion of offering a unique experience and a challenge, the idea of stretching people's sense of what it means to be an OT. And indeed, the people who graduate now, you know, it's not entirely clear what kind of institutions, what kind of settings, what kind of funding is going to be in place for occupational therapists, you know, who are starting on a lifelong career journey now. That future is very uncertain. So whatever we can do to stretch them is valuable. I have this little toy that we use sometimes in futures work. It's just like a little plastic loop that holds its shape. And we say, normally you're looking at the future like this through this restricted lens. And by showing you something that is a bit unique and a bit different, we can stretch your sense of what the future might hold. And you end up looking at the future through a bigger frame. You can't get rid of the frame entirely because we're not omniscient. We don't have infinite time and resources to contemplate the future. But that sense of a stretch, that's what the role emerging placement offers, I think. And it's also what visiting imagined futures can as well. And the other thing I like about that, just before we move on, talk a little bit about the futures work and then to what we did. The idea that role emerging placements actually started as a response to a placement shortage. It reminds us of like how there is opportunity in a crisis, and how sometimes if the context you're operating in changes, there is a chance to actually see something new, something different that wouldn't have been offered before. I know that some of your OT students have gone to some quite interesting and unconventional settings that they might not otherwise have. And it's fascinating for me to realize that the notion of those placements within the profession actually begins because of scarcity.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And actually, this is going off another tangent, but you've just, as you were talking, I was just thinking then about, I teach entrepreneurship. And so there's a paper by Peter Drucker, who's a famous business person, who has written about the 7 sources of innovation. And I can't remember, I apologize, I can't remember all of them, but one of those is this idea that there are constraints or there are things that happen. And COVID's another example, although we're probably all sick of that. But in terms of innovating, you could look at it from that perspective as well, that it is a sort that caused that challenge really stimulated some innovation, and role emergent placement is one example of that.
Absolutely. And there's loads of really interesting ways. If people are listening to this conversation and want to go a bit down that sort of business studies sort of rabbit hole, so I'm an associate fellow of the Saïd Business School, so I end up quite mired in that world. But there's loads of interesting work from Frank Knight, from Richard Rummelt, that really says, you know, if everyone knows what the future holds, there's actually no opportunity to do things differently. So it's really hard to add new value. And that's not just about competition or making more money, but actually, if the system is too sort of hermetic and mechanical and you know how everything's going to play out, it's harder to find that wiggle room that lets new things happen, which really make a difference to the people we serve or to the institutions we work with. Yeah, very last thing, we're just having a good coffee natter here, but it's useful. You know, you're an occupational therapist with an MBA who teaches entrepreneurship. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what took you down that route and what it's taught you?
I think I put it in this program, so all of our students do an entrepreneurship course. It's been co-designed by someone from the Griffith Business School and me. The teaching staff have varied, but I've been a constant teaching member, and there's also been business people come and go. I didn't plan to teach it necessarily, but I wanted it in the program because I saw it as another strategy, more strings in the bow, if you like, for students to graduate with, so that they could live our vision of moving occupational therapy into areas that we hadn't even thought of. And I think we have typically done that trying to use occupational therapy, but I think knowledge and skills and frameworks and theories, I'm not sure that's always worked because I think we're missing some stuff. I think one other bucket of techniques and knowledge and skills is public health. And I know some programs do more and less of that because it's about working with populations. And I just saw entrepreneurship as another set of skills, another toolbox that students could add to their list in terms of looking for opportunities and developments. And so it came into the program first. And then I'd always been interested, so I decided to do an MBA, which I regretted every now and then as assignments were due. But the more I did it, the more I thought there's actually a lot in business, which may or may not be surprising to some people, that I think occupational therapists could learn a lot from. Just the marketing strategy, let alone the mechanics of HR and finance, but some of the stuff which I guess scenario planning fits into, some of that bigger picture thinking about how do we manage not just people, but organizations and situations, and how do we respond to things that happen in the world around us in a strategic and from a business point of view, successful way. It was really interesting to see lots of parallels or lots of useful stuff that we could be using in occupational therapy.
Yeah, I mean, my contact with that community through Griffith and then sort of through the next chain of relationships that followed from that is I saw that OT was very much about this interdisciplinarity, being able to speak to other disciplines and draw on them and learn from them, while still being very applied, like it had to make a difference in the real world. And it was done judiciously. And that focus on the occupational lens meant you knew that an OT was different from other kinds of allied health professional. One of the other projects I just wanted to mention that made me so happy was your colleague Amelia De Tomaso joined a group from the State Library of Queensland, and they actually did a commentary on one of the Marvel superhero movies, Doctor Strange, where we had an archivist an Asian Australian writer who was working to sort of diversify Australian literature and the voices that were heard in Australian literature. And then Amelia there looking at this film and saying, what do we see through our different lenses? And the idea that OT has this substantial intellectual contribution and a distinct perspective that you could even do occupational therapy movie reviews and you would see things in a different light. So I love that idea of interdisciplinarity. Your comments also lead us really nicely onto the future. So I might talk a little bit about scenarios and then see where that takes us. I felt obligated, because this is an academic conference, to put a proper wordy and serious definition up on a slide. So Spaniel and Rowland in 2018 did a kind of massive literature review of all the different ways this word scenario is used, because people use it sometimes to mean like a model run, something that's very speculative, you know, different points on a graph looking at how, say, the pandemic's going to play out or the vaccine rollout is going to go. But it's used in many different ways by many different practitioners and many different thinkers. But the definition they gave is a systematized set of comparatively different narrative descriptions about their user's external context, future-oriented and plausibly possible. And from what I really take is it's stories about the future that you might have to inhabit. You make just enough of them that you can see different ways that future might play out. And the focus is on plausibility. So the way we put it is it's not really about prediction. It's not about assigning a probability to each of these futures. We're not in the forecasting business. And it's also not necessarily about preference. It's not about saying, you know, like, this is the future I want to inhabit. It's offering us futures which challenge and stretch us in the same way that the role emerging placement did. What did you make of when you had that first encounter with me blabbing on about scenarios, Matthew? What did you think in terms of this could be useful, or why did you want to know more? Why did you want to engage on that?
I guess partly because it was me thinking, is this another strategy that we can use to help students think differently about what the future might be? But I guess it also, which it just reminded me of then as you were talking, it also got me thinking about, and some people will disagree with me, and that's another discussion we can talk about, but occupational therapy has a particular culture and ethos. And I think one of the things that we have often complained about, and sometimes quite rightly, is that our future or our present has been constrained and dictated by others outside of the profession. And some of the history stuff, obviously, is the medical profession did lots of that very early on. But even now, in terms of the funding of NHS education, the funding of disability services here in Australia, there are a whole range of things that, to some extent, dictate what we can and can't do. But I think one of the things that I've always enjoyed is trying to push the boundaries and to encourage others to think about, are they actual boundaries or are they perceived boundaries? And I think one of the things about this scenario stuff is it takes you out of that immediate current present and puts you somewhere very different, maybe a bit uncomfortable, but in that difference and uncomfortableness comes a bit of freedom as well to think about, okay, we actually have no constraints except for these 3 or 4 that we're talking about in this future scenario. And so that, I think that was one of the reasons.
That totally makes sense. And there's this concept, strategic reframing. It's actually the name of the book that's kind of the manual for the Oxford scenario planning approach, which is what I teach at the Saïd Business School. And the idea is that you step back and you look at your present day circumstances differently. You look at them in a new light. You see where the opportunities and threats are that you might have missed. You maybe have a completely different sense of what your identity is going to be. But as you say, it lets you kind of look over the walls that you seem to perceive around you in the here and now and say, are they really the obstacles that they were? I mean, there's a reason why Singapore, for example, has a really strong scenario planning culture in government. And if you look at where Singapore is in the world and how geopolitically vulnerable it is, it's surrounded by all these heavy hitters. It's just this very small territory. Of course, they've become really strategically savvy. So in the same way for occupational therapy, a discipline which has felt itself to be constrained sometimes by others is precisely in that position where it might benefit to sort of take that bird's eye view from the future and say, well, how else could this look? And could we build new alliances? Could we take on new roles that are true to our past, but also create opportunities in the future? And yeah. I guess the one other thing to say about that scenario stuff that makes it different from other futures thinking is we're not in this game of telling you how the future is going to play out or even assigning probabilities. So it's not prediction. And as I say, it's not about desirability. That would be like a sea captain saying, I really want to have smooth sailing on this journey, but actually it's beyond the sea captain's control. So we try to create stories of the future that are challenging, not just challenging because they're hard, but challenging because they're different. And the great scenario planner, Joshua Polcher at the OECD, he compares them to tales like the tortoise and the hare. Like, just because this never happened, there was never an actual race between a tortoise and a hare, doesn't mean the story can't teach us something. And I guess that was what we sort of took together into the work we did at Griffith. So yeah, perhaps this is a good time for you to talk about the context of the different kinds of futures work we did at Griffith, because it always came at the end of this role emerging placement, right? Like we also worked with freshers, but
Yeah.
but for third years, we did some more substantive stuff when they came back from placement, didn't we? Can you talk a bit about that?
I guess in terms of the third year stuff, we were looking at a way, because as some people will know, role emerging placements are very challenging for students, because it's again taking them out of their comfort zone. They lose some of the structures that they are used to or would like to have around them, and there are others put in, of course, but it's quite stressful, and they end up doing quite a significant amount of work. So for example, our students in particular, they go 2 days a week in pairs for 12 weeks. And while they're there, they have to implement the occupational therapy process, and understand the needs of the organisation. So this isn't about direct client services. They're very explicitly told that. They have to look at what could occupational therapy or an occupational perspective of humans and health offer this organisation or the people and communities it serves. And then they have to come up with something, design something, and deliver it, but deliver it in such a way that it's wherever possible sustainable, which of course isn't always possible, but that's got to be something they're thinking about. And so they end up working quite hard for this placement. And so we were looking for a way to capture some of the work that they had done, to share that, because we wanted to share it with each other, because the diversity of placements and the diversity of products and outcomes were enormous. So we wanted to share it, but also, I guess, translate the learning, not just from, well, I was at the service for women who are being released from prison, and what I did is only relevant there. We wanted to help them transfer those, the work they did beyond that particular placement, which again is something we try and do quite a lot at Griffith, and not silo their learning, but really broaden them out. And so I think for those reasons, we were looking for something a bit different and a bit more significant, substantial, to wrap up that trimester, essentially.
Yeah.
And we happened to be in contact with Matt Finch.
It was a wonderful, the stars really aligned for us, which was good. I really like that comment you make, that they go on role emerging placement and they lose some of the structures and new ones emerge. Because I think that the idea of going into a kind of liminal space in terms of learning and growth and change, sort of stepping out of the order you're used to, stepping out of the classroom and the certain rhythms and routines, and the idea that, you know, Matthew's going to be in the room and he's going to be in charge, standing at the front by the screen, like to actually be out in the real world is such an opportunity for growth, not just in the sense of what we measure by marks and, you know, results on exams and essays, but actually real change and growth as an individual. And for me, doing futures work alongside the reports back from that placement was maintaining this space of, like, if we let some of those boundaries drop, where else could you go in that territory of who you are as an OT and who you could be? And the other thing I recall from hearing your students come back, because there was that emphasis on something that was sustainable, they couldn't just go in and put on an event. So they actually had to think about, I remember particularly with students who are going into sort of a retirement home, can we make a change to policy wording on the policy documents? Is it about signage and wayfinding? I remember they were looking at ways helping people sort of personalize their space and combining that with, you know, like wayfinding within the institution. So actually it was really, sometimes the solution is about communication. Sometimes, you know, policy is really about rewriting the story of what we do as an institution. So it was really interesting to see them recognize themselves as communicators and storytellers, and people who are convening a conversation about change, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I'm absolutely convinced they're very powerful learning experience as well, emerging placements. Yeah.
And then with the future stuff, I guess there are 3 tools we use that we'll just touch on briefly. That one of them is called The Thing from the Future, which is this famous sort of futurist card game where you imagine an object in a world so many years hence, characterized by certain kinds of change. And it's a really common entry level, very easily accessible Creative Commons licensed card game, which we adapted a bit for occupational therapy. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. But we got people to play this game of, you know, like, here's an object from the future. What can you tell about occupation in that society from that object? And then what difference would an occupational therapist make? What intervention might you make in that society? That was one thing we did. We played a game called OT Island, where students took on roles as clients and therapists and administrators in this imaginary island, where they really had to self-organize. There weren't a lot of rules. We just forced them to figure out for themselves how to run an occupational therapy service in this like safely fictional island. Like, it had an indigenous community, but it was very much set in a make-believe world. So we avoid touching directly on the raw nerve of any real politics or real sort of issues, but it creates this kind of sandbox where people could play with what it meant, and they could even be difficult clients, which is quite a joy for OTs maybe who always have to be on the other side of the divide. And then you did something, it made me so happy, because we worked together whenever we could, but obviously you want things to be sustainable, just like those role emerging placements. You made a sort of time travel activity where people could go between different eras in occupational therapy. I wondered if you could talk about the time travel activity a bit.
So from working with Matt and thinking about scenarios and how do you put students in different situations, I created, in some ways fairly straightforward, in some ways it was a bit crazy and wacky, but a classroom activity. There were 50, 60 students in the class at the same time, and I got them time traveling around the history of occupational therapy. So I got them time traveling through the different paradigms, according to Gary Kielhofner, the different paradigms the profession has moved through, and the crises that caused those paradigms to change. But what I got them to do was, there were clients and occupational therapists in each of those time zones or time periods, and there was another group of students who were the time traveling tourists who moved between them and saw occupational therapy practice in that period. Because of course we can't actually go back to those time periods and see how similar or different occupational therapy practice was. And so this was a way to think a bit differently, but also again, try and take students out of where we were, put them somewhere different and play with what happened. And there was lots of playing, because the students who were occupational therapists were first year, these were first trimester students. First year students had never even thought about this stuff until they'd read the chapter the week before or whatever it was. And they had to think about, well, based on that, what would occupational therapy been like? And I chose very particular clients that some would have fared very well in terms of occupational therapy in each of those time periods, but some would not have received great services because that wasn't a focus or wasn't even thought about in some of those time periods. So it was, again, it was, yeah, I'm thinking that the theme that keeps coming through for me in some of these things is disrupting, taking students out of their comfort zone, trying to get into, in a very lived way, get into a different way of being or a different sort of experience to try it out, essentially. And I think that's the fun of it. You can try it out, see what happens, learn from it, and take something forward to wherever it takes you after that.
Yeah, definitely. And just hearing you say that as well about the, you know, there's this weird thing where you can almost be the right patient for your era and woe betide you if you're the wrong patient for your era. Well, one of the things that comes up a lot when we do future foresight work is how is tomorrow going to judge what we're doing today? And even I did some work with museum and library conservators who have to preserve items for generations hence. And they say their big problem is not the item itself or the way that age wears down the item. Often the problem is bad repairs from the past. Like in the 60s, people used PVA glue and stuff like this, which is actually a nightmare to fix once it's been put on a historic object or document. And they said one of our problems is we need to try and imagine someone 30 years from now undoing our repair because there's a better technology. And in the same way, we can look back on occupational therapy from 50 years ago and we see the blind spots of 60s OTs really easily. But what are OTs in the year 2070 going to see that we can't see around us now? I think that's a fascinating question.
Yeah, yeah. Which is what the next activity allows you to play with a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking, you also said that crises caused all of those historic paradigm changes. And one of the things we try and do with foresight work is instead of having to learn from the brutal audit of a crisis, can we imagine, can we run on ahead in our minds and do some of that learning before we've actually had to suffer? So, you know, it says here on the slide, addressing the problems of an imagined future offered insights into OT's role unavailable in the present. And this slide is an example of one of the outputs or part of the discussions that we had based on Thing from the Future. So this is a world where a rogue scientist has accidentally sort of triggered this robot domination. Like, you know, we've just had in the news this year, right? The first drone attack, I believe, unsupervised drone attack on humans, that kind of like slightly unnerving Terminator future. This kind of wild sci-fi scenario has the robots go rogue, but humans that have tattoos are the only survivors because for some reason the tattoos disrupt the robot's identification. And as a result, people are communicating using their bodies because they can't speak. So it's completely way out there, but it's also an occupational challenge. What do you do when you can't communicate verbally? It's like that movie, A Quiet Place as well, isn't it?
Yes. And this is just one example. There were lots of really weird and wacky scenarios students came up with. And this is using that technique Matt mentioned, the Thing from the Future. So there is a process for the students to get to this point. But this was just the starting point, really, because they came up with these scenarios of what the future was like. And then, as the slide says, the students' task in small groups was to think about what could occupational therapists do if they were in that society for those people or for the society as a whole. And I do remember this bit was lots of fun, students writing, there was lots of laughing and all that sort of stuff. But then when we asked them this question, things went a bit quiet because actually this is hard. And this was in OWIC, wasn't it?
We did it both times. So we've done this.
Okay.
We've done it with third years, but we also did it with freshers, basically, to get them to see, wow, this profession could really go anywhere.
Yeah. But yeah, because the next bit then about, well, what could occupational therapists do? We use it as a way for the students to come back to, which is the same, our same approach for role emergent placements and for more traditional placements, is to come back to the foundation of the profession. So what are the occupational issues inherent in this society for these individuals and these communities of people? And then based on that, what are some of the interventions or ways that occupational therapists could support the individuals, the community, to fulfill their occupational needs? And so, some of it was weird and wacky, but it just reminds me of, I've also done an exercise with students, because I think students just get so limited unconsciously and consciously by these perceived barriers they have about, oh, you could never do that. Another activity I've done, which is not about scenarios, so I'll just say it very quickly, is where I give students a client scenario about Mrs. Jones, who's had a stroke, who lives such and such. And I say, we're not working for any health service. You've got unlimited budget, unlimited resources. Design the ideal occupational therapy service for this woman. And so they spend lots of time, but they have to catch themselves from saying, well, we can't do that because, and well, actually you can do anything you want in this scenario. And then I get them to come back to, so how much of that would be possible in the NHS or in Queensland Health here in Australia? And one of the things they realize is actually there's not a huge gap. That if you think a bit creatively and a bit differently, or let yourself even think that broadly, you can actually achieve a lot even within the constraints that you're in. But I've just thrown that in, Matt, but it just reminded me of that idea of there are similarities about changing the parameters, but then bringing it back to thinking about what of this can we use here and now, or thinking about the future.
Definitely. I think that both practices have an awful lot in common. And you use this word design. I think it's really important that, you know, scenario planning also treats strategy as a design problem. And the idea of bringing design thinking into occupational therapy, precisely because of the nature of the profession, you know, it's always about designing and configuring relationships and resources and services. And weirdly, this idea of, you know, what would you do in the utopian world? Another one of these slips, like the one on screen now, my absolute favorite. I remember this young student, she ended up with a world, it was like 5,000 years hence. And basically it was a complete utopia. Everyone was completely fulfilled in every single way. And she was rather stumped that she'd created this world. And then she was trying to figure out what an OT would do in and for that society. But she actually ended up figuring out that, were people really satisfied? Were they happy? Were they actually having their occupational wants, needs, and desires met? Were they reporting that fact, but was it actually true? And she ended up imagining a role for an occupational therapist in that future, which was almost more like being something between being an investigative journalist and an ombudsman, where she was actually kind of monitoring occupation in utopia and checking that people were really okay and there wasn't other things going on beneath the surface. And then when she returned from that 5,000 year future, she said, well, this is clearly something I need to do as a practitioner in the present as well, is be mindful of those layers of what we perceive and what we report, and whether people are truly fulfilled and whether the needs are being met. So even in utopia, an OT would still have work to do.
Yeah. They're great experiences, I think.
Yeah, and just on you were talking about freshers, and just as we move on to practice implications, I also remember the idea of really stretching students about, you know, oh man, what am I in for over the next 4 years of this degree and my future career? When we started working together, a few students struggled to recall all the elements of the CMOP-E, that is it the Canadian model of occupational performance and engagement? Performance and engagement, I still got it right. And wonderfully, such a good educator, you really let them struggle through and remember it for themselves. You didn't sort of leap in and answer it for them when I was there as a guest and they sort of fumbled the definition. And so subsequently, we started doing this activity where we got someone to bake the CMOP-E diagram as a cake. And in sort of pretty much week one of your career as an occupational therapy student, we said, you know, you're going to eat the CMOP-E, you're going to have this memorable, playful experience where you start to internalize that model literally. But I think that notion of play is really fundamental to the work you're doing at Griffith. I don't know if you'd agree. It's a very playful course.
Well, we try to be, and I guess some of that, talking about your design stuff, thinking about your comments about design as well, is I think lots of occupational therapy programs don't have, like when I was a student, we did a course on woodwork and we did a course where we did macrame and pottery and all those sorts of things. So that sort of play, creativity has gone in lots of programs. And so I think maybe this is a way to try and capture or to retain or return to some of those things. But it's also more fun for the educators as well as the students.
I think it always helps the learning environment if you're enjoying it. I mean, we definitely say at the business school, if you're not having fun doing scenario planning, like imagining these challenging futures, then you've gone adrift somewhere. So we always try to have that bit of challenge and play. I was thinking, I mean, in your position, you know, heading up an occupational therapy department at Griffith, with your experience and your academic background as well, what are the implications though? It's fun to do this scenario stuff. We have a good time. The students enjoy it. They seem to learn from it. Are there wider implications for occupational therapy about using a scenarios or foresight approach?
Well, is that your segue into this slide? Because I think, because yeah, I guess that's one of our messages we'd like to get across is we have used these very powerfully with students, and we've given you a bit of an insight into that. But we have talked quite a bit, actually, Matt and I, about using scenario planning and what that would be like for other members of the profession. And I just can't see how it wouldn't be useful, because I think all of the stuff we've talked about in terms of getting us out of our current situation and thinking really without boundaries or with very different boundaries that force us to think in a very different way, can only be useful, because it does require us, I keep saying, which is what that bottom comment there is about, is I really have seen, and I believe really strongly, that this sort of work challenges our professional identity, because like that scenario we just heard about with the tattoos, or the utopian scenario, some reactions might be, well, there's nothing here occupational therapy could offer. But actually, right through working through it, discussing it, playing with it, I've seen it strengthen students' professional identity. And I'm really curious. I think it's definitely useful. And we have talked quite a lot about trying to do this work with other occupational therapists, to play with it with them, I guess.
Yeah, and there's some really interesting work going on in health and allied health using scenarios. Diabetes UK has done a couple of rounds of scenarios. They're a big charity in the UK, which is very, works very closely with the NHS to support people who have diabetes. And they do a lot of futures work to say, well, what's the future going to be like that we have to inhabit? What's it going to mean for charities, for public health, for state healthcare services, and for conditions that may or may not be sort of cured in the future? Anytime that the future is not just going to be another point on the graph, it's useful to think through these uncertainties. And even then, when you think you know the trends, Jed Davis, another great scenario planner, said, a trend is a trend until it bends or until it breaks, which is kind of what we saw over the past 18 months or so, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So for me, particularly, because occupational therapies rests on this concept of occupation, we can't fully know what occupations are going to look like in 2, 5, 10, 20 years. At the end of 2019, we might not have been able to imagine the occupational landscape of 2020, like the ways in which the pandemic and our response to it forced people to change the way they lived in so many ways. So I guess that notion of stretching is useful, not just for getting students kind of limber about their journey into OT, but maybe for where the profession goes, and including education of the profession. What does it mean to be an OT who runs a department or works in a department within a university? There's a lot of opportunities there for stretch.
Yeah, definitely.
That seems like a good moment to come on to the final slide. Go on.
Yes, I think so. I was just going to say, I don't know how long this has gone for, but it's been a fun conversation for us, at least, or for me. I'm talking to both of us. And I'll hand over to Matt again in a minute, but we'd be really happy to talk to you about this even more. So you've got the 3-minute version at the conference, and now you've got the however long this version is. But there's actually lots of potential here, we think. And so, yeah, we'd be really keen to chat more with people, and hope this has been useful and a fun experiment, for me at least, in alternative conference formats.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It's really the first potential step on a journey, and you're really welcome to join this conversation in any way you want. There's email addresses on here. We're both people who are pretty easy to find online, and we're really happy to talk, and you can pick our brains, and maybe this is the beginning of a conversation about the future of OT. So thank you everyone who's been with us today, and we hope this is the beginning of a longer conversation.
Bye everyone.